Good afternoon, everybody. If you can make your way in at the door, and I see Dr. Pascoe over there, if she wouldn't mind closing the doors to keep the noise out. Thank you very much. All right, well, it gives me really tremendous pleasure to introduce Dr. Jo Shapiro. She is an associate professor of ENT head and neck surgery at Harvard Medical School. She's the principal faculty for the Center for Medical Simulation in Boston and a consultant for the Massachusetts General Hospital Department of Anesthesia, Pain, and Critical Care. As I said earlier this morning, in 2008, she founded the Brigham and Women's Hospital Center for Professionalism and Peer Support, where she served as the director for over 10 years. In 2018, the Harvard Medical School gave her the Shirley Driscoll Dean's Award for the Advancement of Women Careers. She continues to educate and assist organizations in developing specific programmatic educational approaches such as peer support, disclosure, apology, well-being programs, professionalism initiatives, and conflict management. And as I can attest to personally, we had a wonderful peer support training event with her not too long ago, as we talked about earlier today. So I'm really looking forward to your talk, Jo.
Well, it is truly an honor to be here. And before I say anything else, I just want to thank all of you for not just being here and being part of such an amazing society, but also for the work you do. I am fully aware of the intensity and the importance of the patients you take care of. It's just in a whole different class, I think, of care that's required of you all. And I'm deeply appreciative. I want to shout out to Tom Clancy for taking care of my friend Billy. And I just know all of you put in such amazing amount of time and energy and wisdom. So thank you. I can't say another word without acknowledging Dr. Doyle, who, as you all know, is a very special leader. This work that I'm going to talk about is intensely community dependent. So is the work, all of the work that we do. We cannot do this alone, the kind of work that we're all doing. So I want to thank you so much for your leadership, and also to shout out to Dr. Pomfret, who was really the first person I worked with around doing the peer support work on a national level as a society, and not just within individual healthcare organizations. So thanks so much for all of your leadership, and some of my other colleagues that you see here acknowledge, but there's plenty more of you. And thanks also to the peer supporters in your society now who've been trained and we're willing to show up for the training and also to be there for each other. So what I want to just say at the outset is we in medicine, the culture of medicine, have inherited a culture that is can be beautiful, like the fact that we're all healers in some way or other, and nobody's going to take that from us. But we've also inherited some really bad stuff. And when I say inherited, it was given to us, we breathed it in, and I think that we've internalized some of the things that have been really harmful to us as individual healthcare providers, and also, on a societal level. And I think this is what I've put up here is my way of looking at some of the dark side of our culture, of the profession of medicine. The idea that we've been really, truly, that our own well-being has been incredibly undervalued. And again, that we've internalized this. Now, let me say this, I think you can all agree that we are not here in our profession to do self-aggrandizement or, because we're here to just, take individual attention on ourselves. We're here because we want to serve, right? But we can't serve. We cannot do the kind of work that we're entrusted to do if we are falling apart. We just can't do it. If we could, great. I'd say, don't pay any attention to us individually. It's just not a sustainable way to be. And we are now seeing the outcome of the years and years of a culture that said, we don't matter. Those of us delivering the care don't matter. All that matters are our patients. But again, you cannot have one without the other. So when I talk about this in more depth with you today, keep in mind that what motivates me and what I know motivates all of you at the end of the day is the care that we give to others. But my argument is that care, that level of that care is not sustainable if we ignore our own well-being. So we have a lot of stressors that we face in our profession, right? These are just some of them. And some of them are should be gone. Anything that has to do with bullying or racism or, unprofessional behavior, those things should go away. And part of my career has been dedicated to improving the culture of medicine, but some of them are intrinsic to the work that we do. We're never going to eliminate adverse events and certainly not errors. That's, I wish we could, but that's not going to happen. Things are going to go wrong, but also, and especially I can say, in your subspecialty is your patients, regardless of really phenomenal care, some of them are not going to do well, right? We can't, none of us went into this to say we're only here to take care of people who are going to have great outcomes. Like, that's just not the way it goes. And obviously I'm preaching to the choir in this particular room, that. But these things take a toll on us. They do. And they're stressors that are part of the work that we do. So what I'd like to focus on next is a particular stressor. Not that it's the most common thing that happens in our careers, but it is universal. If it hasn't happened to you, it will. And it is one of the most devastating things that happens to us in our careers, right? And there's a lot of data about some of that devastation and what we could do about it. So I want you to just individually reflect on, think of a time when you were involved in causing inadvertent harm to a patient. And just to reflect on you, I bet every single one of you in that, the quote that Dr. Doyle said about, the graveyards that people revisit, certainly surgeons, we do. Can you remember any emotion that you felt after realizing, oh my gosh, what just happened might cause permanent harm to my patient? Anybody willing to just say an emotion that you remember feeling? You don't have to tell us any of the circumstances, and I absolutely guarantee that anything you say will have been universally experienced by all of us. Anybody? Angry. Shame, big one. By the way, shame is where we go from saying, I feel terrible about this, to I feel terrible about this, and it happened because I am not good enough. I am deficient. I have failed my patients in a fundamental way. Anything else people remember feeling? Sadness, yeah, for sure. So yes, it's, we each respond individually. Of course, I'm very respectful of that, but there are certain very common emotions, some of which you all just named, after we realize we've been involved in medical errors. And so the feeling of shame, of course, can really trigger imposter syndrome and self-doubt. Am I good enough to do this work? I'd like to ask you, anybody in this room who has never doubted themselves, would you please raise your hand? You can leave now. Yeah, I mean, would you actually want a colleague who has never experienced self-doubt, never looked inward and said, am I good enough? We all, because we care, and also we are learners, lifelong learners. And to learn, you have to think of what could I do going forward to be better, right? So part of, I think, this self-doubt is completely appropriate and normal. The problem is sometimes it really gets under our skin and doesn't leave us. So I'll talk more about that. So I was always wondering, like, why are we so ashamed? And I like this study that compared attitudes and enculturation around in aviation and medicine to errors, and found that both stressed the need for perfection and a deep perception of personal invulnerability. Okay, so what that means is we have been told in so many words and internalize this, that for us to keep patients safe, we need to expect error-free performance from ourselves and everybody else all of the time. That's what we were taught. Now, wouldn't that be great? I would love to say that's possible, but you all know, being students and teachers of patient safety science, that's an absolute impossibility. We are human. Humans are literally wired to make errors. So good luck with this idea that if you make an error, that means you are, well, good luck with the idea that you're supposed to be perfect, because perfection is absolutely impossible. And so the fundamental science about how we operate literally and figuratively as humans goes against the enculturation of we're not supposed to make errors. That's pretty hard to bear. So the natural response to that is, if I do make an error, it means, it's something shameful. The other thing is society expects a lot of us, and dare I say, perfection. It does really in many ways, and not just our profession, but certainly in our profession. And I think in some ways it's exemplified in kind of a good way of, like, the healthcare hero label, especially that we got during COVID. But what I watched in my colleagues, and when I was doing a lot of peer support through COVID, as I had been beforehand, is this sense that we were supposed to be superhuman, like superheroes, not need as much sleep, go doing work that we were never trained to do, not processing deaths and, complete tumult and healthcare disparities and all the things that we were all holding, if you will. Somehow it wasn't supposed to affect us. And that's just, like I said, in the moment, I'm not talking about, by the way, just, you're in the middle of a code or, something going wrong in the OR and you're like, oh, this is so stressful for me. Let me just go and, go to the spa. No, I mean, like, we have to get through the day, the week, but never processing our emotions, never processing our physical, mental, emotional response to what we have been asked to do. That's what I'm saying is unsustainable. And I think our surgical culture in particular, but, I could say just the profession of medicine, places such a high value on putting our heads down, getting our work done. Just do your job. Do your job. And we, again, we've internalized that. And also, hey, you signed up for this. Yet, what did you think it was going to be easy? I mean, no. So you signed up for this goes along with, like, and it should never affect you. And then the other thing is, especially when we're dealing with errors, is, I mean, we're just not used to being in positions where we aren't, expected to or expect ourselves to fix things. And once something has gone wrong, sometimes we're in this position of it's not something that we can fix. So you can see where the shame comes from. Fear. I think everybody I know has been afraid when they realize they've caused harm. And I'm just going to shout out some of the reasons we're afraid. So one of them is, obviously we're afraid of, like, what's going to happen to the patient. And we are afraid of what our colleagues will think of us. And I think, Dr. Doyle, when you were talking about your first adverse event as a junior faculty, your thought was, oh my gosh, people are going to think I'm a really bad surgeon. And that's pretty universal, because we care deeply about what our colleagues think of us, as we should. And our reputation in that sense is very important to us, right? And so we're afraid of that reputation being harmed by our human fallibility. What else we're afraid of? Well, people are afraid of job consequences, right? And then the elephant in the room is, who here isn't a little bit afraid of getting sued? Okay, because these are very intensely upsetting consequences that can happen after harm events. And then there's some anger that our system is treating us in a way that it shouldn't be. So I want, could you raise your hand if in your organization, your healthcare organization, did you all get the memo that we're done with shame and blame? No, right. Of course not. Nobody sent that memo out. But think about it. So we know we're saying we want to get to a just culture. So what a just culture is, a culture that says when things go wrong, our responsibility is to learn and to prevent that going wrong from happening to a patient in the future. That is our responsibility. Now, what we thought back in the day was that shame and blame would make the system safer, because just if you make somebody feel bad enough about what happened, they'll never do it again and it'll be a safer system. But now we know also from safety science, it's the opposite. Shame and blame literally makes it very hard for us to learn. It certainly doesn't let us look at both our own personal accountability in a way that's with some self-compassion, but also looking at what are the systems issues that might have set it up for us to make the error, and that if they aren't changed, something will happen in the future. I want to be very clear, and I always have to say this, especially to us as surgeons, is I am not talking about not having personal accountability. Right? It's either a systems issue or personal accountability. It's almost always both. What could I have personally done differently? How could I learn and be better going forward? And also, again, what are the systems issues that may set it up so that my colleague is going to make the same error, in a month or so? That's what we're going for. But you don't leave an embedded culture like shame and blame just by saying we're doing a new one now, right? So I think it behooves us to think about where are we still doing shame and blame, and then consciously be aware of that and stop doing it so that we can move towards this safety culture. So if you haven't seen this study, it's so fascinating and horrifying, but basically they looked at the referrals when a woman surgeon's patient, there was a death of a woman surgeon's patient, and those referrals dropped by 54%, where there was almost no effect on referrals to male surgeons who had a patient die. Okay, now this is obviously unconscious bias, right? I don't put it here for that reason. I put it here to say that we do judge each other. Of course we do. Right? And sometimes it may be differentially towards gender or a race, but mostly it's just we're pretty judgy. Okay, so how do you get around that? You get around it by recognizing that you're being judgy. I am judgy. Sometimes my first reaction when I hear something has gone wrong is, oh my gosh, what were they thinking? I have to notice that I'm doing that and say, hey, they're pretty smart and really a great surgeon. I wonder what they were thinking, and I wonder, how we can all learn from that. So it requires seeing how we do things for us to change them. And then this is just a list of processes that happen after harm events that may happen. And I put some that are, I've had the pleasure of working in different countries, including Ireland. And by the way, I added this to my slide, which is that I am an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons Ireland, which I take great pride in. But what I realize is that every country, I mean, not that I work in every country, but I do think that every country has things that happen, right? Processes that are kicked off when there's been a harm event. And if you look at this list, you can see they could be done in a just culture, safety culture, learning and growth mindset, but often they're not. And so our job, and I want you to take this and go forward, is to see if in these processes, can we hold to a safety culture that says we're responsible for learning, not punishment. Now, I'm not saying that there's never a time when someone shouldn't be punished. I mean, people who do reckless things, of course, need some kind of accountability and consequences. But that's so rare. That is so rare. So what I'm saying is, let's look at the processes that we have, and we have the power to change them. I also want to talk about the court of law. Now, the way the litigation system works, especially in this country, it's complete shame and blame, right? Are the lawyers like, let's really try to learn from this? Like, that's really why we're all here. No, I don't think so. It's rooted in shame and blame. But I want to give you all hope, and this is my belief. In 10 years, we will be done with the current litigation system because every single one of our healthcare organizations will have adopted a communication resolution program, which is a fully about transparency and compassion towards the patients, towards us giving the care with restitution if there has been negligence. And it's generally keeping it out of the court system. All of these things we can change. We can make them about learning and about growth and not about punishment. So all of this can let people, leave people feeling angry. But the one I want to just, land on for a minute is this feeling of being alone. Like I'm just people feeling I'm just so not good enough, or, no one has made a mistake like this before, or even if it's not an error, nobody has been affected by patient death the way I have been, though it wasn't in my control, those sorts of things. And because I do so much peer support, let me just tell you, oh yeah, everybody's felt that. Everybody. And your organization, I mean, I've had such an amazing time listening to you and interacting with you and learning from you. I've got to say that you have demonstrated the importance of community. And if you just, again, look at Dr. Doyle's presidential address, how much time she spent on honoring the people who have helped her and on whom she continues to rely, this interdependence, and all the people that are relying on her and that she's continuing to support and bring up. We are interdependent. And if you think about surgery, we've had such an overvaluing of independence, right, that I think it got lost how interdependent we truly are. And if we really want to be good, we foster that interdependence. We foster it. The worst surgeons are the ones that don't ever look for help. You know that, and I know that. But we have equated that with that vulnerability with weakness, when in fact, vulnerability is a sign of courage. And there's a lot of, written about that you might have read in the non-medical literature. So what I want to say is that whatever we do, we've got to keep us in community. We have to keep people from feeling isolated, because especially if you take these stressors that we have in medicine, right? And then you layer on to somebody who's having struggles with mental illness, you are going to be in trouble if that person is feeling alone, because that's when it's dangerous for them. And so many people have suffered alone needlessly because they didn't feel part of a community, and they felt like they were really made to just deal with things alone, and that's really impossible at some point. So what I want to say is all those emotions that I just went through, I mean, they're normal. Would anybody in this room want to raise a generation of clinicians that said, like, meh, things go wrong, it's not my fault, systems? Yeah, I see people die and I signed up for this. No, we hurt because we care, right? And many times we move through it. We do. Time does heal many, many times. The problem is sometimes recovery is thwarted. And this really can cause significant problems. There's tons of data I could put up here, but I'll show you just a couple. This is just specifically around errors. All of the things that can happen, and that do happen, this was US and Canadian physicians, post errors. And you can see that's a lot of suffering. And interestingly, the blue bar actually shows even if the error didn't reach the patient, this is how much we care about the integrity of our work, that even with that, right, we still walk away with many of these real significantly negative outcomes. We know we did a study where we looked at nurses and physicians when I was at the Brigham compared to nurses and physicians at a hospital in the UK, and found no difference, by the way, between the four groups, but that almost a third had some really significant ongoing suffering in these domains. We know from the data that burnout and depression are independent predictors, right, of having made a recent major medical error. And it's a vicious cycle. If you have made an error, you have a higher chance of becoming burnt out. But if you're burnt out from any cause, you have a higher chance of making a medical error. And I think most tragically, making an error is a risk factor for physician suicide, for suicidal ideation, and probably, though this is very hard to study, and I think I don't want to say this, but I certainly have heard of physicians who died by suicide after an error. Okay, it is a risk factor. It is not the only one. I get that, but we have to do something. We cannot do business as usual. It's imperative. So we were looking at this years ago, and we wanted to look at different stressors and then try to think from the data that we got, what can we do to facilitate coping and resilience? And resilience as defined very broadly by growth through adversity. Okay, it doesn't mean like doing yoga, that kind of thing, but it means what can we do so that people come through these traumatic stressors, whether they be error or not? What can we do? And so I'm going to show you the graph that just where there was one question on the survey that asked, if you were involved in one of the stressors, specifically a medical error, where would you want to get support from? And 88% wanted to be supported by a physician colleague. Great EAP, great mental health professionals, but 88% wanted to be supported by a physician colleague. There's something about being with somebody, sitting with virtually or in person with somebody who gets it on the deepest possible level. So another study looked at also wisdom through adversity, specifically about errors, a physician study, and what were the factors that correlated with gaining wisdom and as opposed to some of the awful negative outcomes. And one of them was talking about it with colleagues. So we said, okay, let's build a system that's based on the data, that shows what we want, right? And it's a spectrum. Like what I'm talking about is formal peer support, and it's in the setting of a spectrum. So I bet every one of you has been an informal peer supporter. Someone's come to you and said this happened, and you give them support, and that can be enough for some people, but not everybody. Not everybody. Sometimes people need more than that. And that's what formal peer support is. It is not therapy. I mean, the good news of dealing with surgeons is nobody mistakes us for a therapist. And we're not, and we shouldn't be, and it would be taking on, first of all, a responsibility that I don't think we should be shouldering. I mean, we don't want to cause peer supporters to be burnt out. But bottom line is, we are there in a very specific kind of way that can help people feel connected, not alone. And then our job is to, as peer supporters, is to destigmatize and facilitate referrals for further help, more longitudinal, if the peer wants them. Because guess what? We all have systems where there's, psychiatrists available and employee assistance program. And I think we do, but they're vastly underutilized, especially by physicians, because we just don't go to those people for all of the reasons around stigma and even fear of licensure issues. And so our job is, as peer supporters, is to help people get more help if they want it, but never forcing anybody to do so. So that's where peer support sits in a spectrum. The principles are, and the most important one, and our peer supporters here know that, is to bring your loving presence to your colleague. You are not there to fix their pain, which as a surgeon, it's hard because we just want to tell them, look, do the following steps and, you shall feel better, right? Because we want to fix, but you can't fix your colleague's pain. Right. But bearing witness to it through, really validating that this is very common, that you felt this way, et cetera. But then helping them strategize and move forward using their own coping mechanisms. What do you do to get yourself back in online? What kinds of support systems can you access? Who are your friends? Who are your colleagues that you trust? Those sorts of things. So the idea is partnering with them for that session so that they can start to think of how to move forward. And then also helping people put this event, whatever the stressor is, in perspective. And one of the things that I want to say to you that it is remarkable to me how little self-compassion that we have. Self-compassion. We are so harsh on ourselves. And so one of the things we can do as peer supporters is to point out that self-compassion is really important, and it's hard to move forward without it. And that they, as peers, if they were asked to peer support their colleague, would say the same thing. Hey, you're being really harsh on yourself. It doesn't mean that we don't take personal responsibility, but not to the point that we are completely demoralized. So these are the principles of peer support. I'm not here to, teach you to be peer supporters, but, it's not magic. And yet it's a very different way of being with a colleague than we're used to being. It's not the same as taking care of a patient either, right? It just isn't. It's very different. It's a different kind of way of being. And so that's why, I'm biased. Obviously, I'm an educator, but I believe we should train people. I don't think to ask people to do something we're not used to doing is really fair. So this is a quote from a colleague of mine with whom I wrote a New England Journal article around sort of COVID and beyond support. And we wanted to use this, if you build it, they won't come, as the title, but it turns out New England Journal doesn't think those things are funny. So we didn't. But the idea, and this is from Tim, it's actually, it was his quote, that there's so many programs that are built and nobody shows up, right? Physicians especially don't show up. So the idea was to take down the barriers for peer support so that people who want it, never forcing anybody to have it, who want it can actually access it. And that's how we designed when I was at the Brigham, how we designed the peer support program. What are those barriers? I think, this came out in that same study that I showed you, lots of barriers, but stigma is certainly one of them. We just don't want to see ourselves as weak, and we certainly don't want to have others see ourselves as weak. So, and these are the cultural barriers, I think, and this is just my opinion. And that last one is, I just think that idea that we've really been taught, maybe without saying explicitly, that self-care and self-compassion are selfish, and they're not. They're absolutely key to being the kind of healers that we want to be. So ideally, I think peer support should have a reach out component, if possible. But in any case, we want to make it so that it's very easy for physicians to get the support. So doing this in a national organization requires you're all knowing that it's available, trusting the people who are peer supporters, right? And the people who lead the peer support program, and encouraging both yourself and your colleagues to access that support. That is so important, because that will change the culture. And by the way, the culture is simply, and this is a quote from a colleague of mine, Tony Suitman, who's a physician, a culture is patterns of relating that persist or change through ongoing interaction. So we can change the culture without taking a vote or changing our bylaws to say, when there have been stressful events, we can proactively reach out to our colleagues and say, hey, I've been there. I just wondered if you might want to consider some peer support, and then helping them get in touch with one of the peer supporters in your society. It's so important. And I got to tell you, now, most of the peer support programs that I've helped develop are within a hospital, within a healthcare organization. And I think those are great. Obviously, I do, mainly that. But I have to tell you, I think the ones that are done in a society like this are in some ways more powerful, because the degree of trust that you have, because by statistics that any of those peer supporters that are trained by, in your society have been there in some way or another, just like you have. There's this absolute understanding. Right. No, it's not like I couldn't peer support you. I could, but there is something really special about having it be, a colleague who really gets it. I'm just going to tell you an anecdote before I wrap up. And so this is a picture of my husband who's here, and my aunt who, an amazing person, incredibly active. So in November, my husband and I and my sister and brother-in-law, and we hadn't been to New York. She, lived in Manhattan for her whole life, and very active, taking us on trips to Patagonia. I mean, you name it, Costa Rica, just all she's a world traveler. And that weekend we went to a play. She took us all to a play, and she will not take a cab. It had to be like subway up and down the steps. And, even like the theater was like, this incredibly steep incline, and she's like 93, moving along and faster walking than we were. We walked all over the city. An amazing weekend. We just had such a good time. And my husband and I slept overnight. And the next morning, my aunt woke up and she said, something is wrong. And she sat down and she died. Just lost her, like died. So my husband's a pulmonologist, and I could assist him. We did CPR. We had EMTs come, nothing, got her to hospital. She died. She did die. She was the healthiest 93-year-old you will ever meet. Okay. Now first of all, I don't recommend having to do CPR on your 93-year-old, tiny little aunt. But I will say this, that, if I had to have a death, that's what I would do. But, the idea oh my gosh, she would have died alone. And when she would have been discovered, I don't know. But we saw her die. We were with her and she didn't suffer. Okay. So why am I telling you this story? But, we had to bury her. We were supposed to leave that morning, and I was scheduled the next day to do a virtual peer support at UC Irvine. And so I called, but we were going to have to stay in New York in my aunt's apartment. And so I called the Dina McRae, who's the head of GME at UCI. And I said, hey, just want to tell you what happened. So I might be just a little, jumpy tomorrow, whatever. She goes, oh, do you want to cancel? I was like, no, I'm going to do, obviously I'll do peer support training and grand rounds and everything I'm scheduled for. Meanwhile, I'm telling my, everybody else in my family, cancel, but me, no. So I do it, right? And then the following day, which was going to be the morning before we buried her, I was scheduled to do another peer support training, and Dina texts me. She goes, I know you're a grown-up, but I just want to make sure, are you sure you don't want to cancel? And I was like, heck yes, I do want to cancel. Okay, so what did that tell me? First of all, we laughed at the hypocrisy of my being an expert in well-being, completely denying my own needs, right? Which is such hubris, because what did I think? I couldn't, why? I don't know. Well, I do know, because I drank the Kool-Aid years ago, which is yes, this is for everybody else, but I have to soldier on. And we just laughed she's a psychiatrist, so I just laughed at myself, which I think is, one of the things I do like to do. But it just showed me how ingrained our culture of being independent and self-sufficient and never suffering and never taking a moment saying what, is this reasonable that I'm going to go ahead and do this service for other people? So I'm not at all comparing it to anything in medicine like errors, but I just wanted to tell you, how deep it is in us to not take care of ourselves. And that's why I think, need these actual programs to say, yeah, we're here, and why I needed Dina to call me and say, are you sure? I needed that, apparently. And it just made so much sense to me when she really questioned it. So I think if we can reframe vulnerability as courage, and I do think it is, the most courageous people, and physicians in particular, I know, are people who can say, I'm not in this alone. I need help from other people sometimes. And I value other people's input. I think it's really important. So I do think peer support should be for any kind of stressor. It could be chronic, it could be acute. I spent time today on errors because we have so much data about them, and they're so intense, but there's so many things we see that are stressful that I think I'm also hopeful in, maybe less than 10 years, that people will start to, if they don't have an outreach or a colleague, ask them, and more deeply, how they're doing, they'll be like, hey, how come no one reached out to me? Instead of we're sort of expected to just march on forward, where it can be really hard to do so. Okay. And I think we should, broaden that our understanding of what can be stressful to somebody without making assumptions. That's why it's the offer that's so important, and the ease through which you can access the support, because you don't have to be, crawling on the floor, metaphorically suffering, to be somebody who could benefit by talking to a colleague. We've all done it. It's a beautiful thing. It really is a beautiful thing. This is the programs I hope you all just, really are involved in your organizations, and if not, push them to do so. I do think peer support, I hope, is a cultural change driver. I think it's really, pushing us away from those old cultures and more towards ones that I think are much more sustainable and create much more longevity and joy in work. I don't use the term second victim. This is a quote from Parker Palmer, who's an educator and activist. It's not about errors, but I think this is true. I think victimhood is sort of lacks agency. I thought it was a great term when it came out. Also, I work closely with patient advocates, and they do not like our referring to ourselves as victims after we've harmed them. It just doesn't sit right. And so to me, it's like, okay, so don't use the term, but I've never had anybody say, wait, what are you talking about? This is a tweet, and I just want to read it to you, and I just think it's beautiful. I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or for how many. Instead of hearing you are one of the most resilient people I know, I want to hear you are so loved. You are so cared for. You are genuinely covered. And I want to close by saying, you are so loved. Thank you.
You have, oh, thank you, Dr. Shapiro. That was outstanding. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, I think we have. The clock says we have time if Dr. Shapiro is okay with that.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. That was just outstanding. I was reflecting on this, and it was an incident that happened to a friend of mine from medical school. You probably know about this case because it was in Boston at the Brigham. And it was an anesthesiologist that went to do a local block for an orthopedic procedure that turned into a cardiac arrest, open chest. And the patient came this close to dying from what was supposed to be an ankle operation. And my friend was the anesthesiologist that did the block. And so when things stabilized, he went up to the ICU to see the patient, and he was basically thrown out of the ICU by the doc saying, why are you here? You're just going to upset this patient. It's the blame and shame. And then the patient was in the hospital for another couple of weeks. He tried to see her again before discharge, and risk management said, you cannot go see this patient. And because of his persistence, it was a couple of months later, he wrote to the patient against all advice from risk management, everyone else that was managing the problem. And she wasn't ready to deal with it at the time. She was recovering from a sternotomy, and she basically said, I can't deal with you right now. But I don't know, probably a year later, reached out to him, met with him, and forgave him. And it was the only, and she realized that the patient realized until she did this guy can't get on with his life. He was so paralyzed by what happened. And now the two of them go around as part of IHI and talking about this culture of safety and forgiveness. So where does the patient come in, and how do we deal with the fact that the system is telling us risk management, don't say anything, don't disclose, don't say you're sorry. Is that required for healing?
That's a great question. So yes, I know them very well. In fact, they're two of the people that I, Rick and Linda, who I work with when we were thinking about doing peer support. The first thing I want to say is that when something has gone wrong, when there's been a harm event, it is completely, it's our responsibility to be there for the patient, right? If they want us to be, or make sure somebody else is. And we should never be dependent on their forgiveness. Now, I got to say this, we all know sometimes patients are incredibly forgiving, and it's so healing. And I have some expertise, and I've developed a program in disclosure coaching. So we're helping healthcare providers, but particularly physicians, go in and have difficult conversations with patients. And what I say as part of that conversation is, even though you're going to want to be forgiven for the patient, get your loving elsewhere. It is not their responsibility to forgive you. If they do, take it, it's a gift. So I think that's so important, because, oh boy, do we want to be forgiven. But what we need to do is to forgive each other and forgive ourselves ultimately, which is a separate process. So I think there's that. But I want to, in addition to that, I want to deal with the question around, don't talk to anybody, because how do you have a peer support program when risk managers will tell you as soon as there's a harm event, don't talk to anybody? So we started the program with the blessing of risk management, our risk insurers. CRICO insures all the Harvard hospitals, and even the defense attorneys. Why? Because a lot of us push really hard, but mainly because we looked at it as a risk benefit. Okay. The risk of having this conversation in terms of it being a lawsuit later on, And the prosecuting attorney, will say to the physician defendant, did you talk to anybody about this? Now, what are they looking for? They're looking for, did you talk to a colleague who said, I wouldn't have operated on this patient, right? That's what they're looking for. They are not looking for whether you got some emotional support or not. They just don't care, right? In fact, our defense attorneys were like, bring it on. I wish it would get in the courtroom because it would look really good for the defendant, but be that as it may, it's still a theoretical risk. In all my years, I've never seen that happen. So, it's a theoretical risk. But what we really pushed was the risk of not doing this is huge. So just like surgery, it's risk benefit. So we know the risk of not doing this. And that's some of the statistics I showed you. So we got legal on board. We got everybody on board to say, like, we're just going to let it happen. And I've never seen harm come, though I wouldn't, if you were peer supporter and you weren't comfortable doing this, I would say don't do it. But I think it's because, people know that that's not, it's just, it's so small, that risk. And also, we looked at this and said, are we going to let a really messed up system prevent us from doing the right thing? And that is true with the disclosure process too. Like, whether or not apology is protected by law or whatever, we've got to apologize if we've created harm, and we've got to have these conversations. So I think what went wrong in that situation, and by the way, the patient's husband almost punched the anesthesiologist. So sometimes that, it's not going to happen, and we can't force it on patients, right? And in this case, as you eloquently described, it took the patient time to say, I want to do this too, because it will help me heal. But again, never want to put it back on the patient.
Yeah, very unusual patient.
Yeah, very unusual. It has. I work very closely with her. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank
That was
you.
Fantastic talk.
Thanks.
Hi, for those who don't know me, Liz Pomfret, University of Colorado. I was in Boston for a long time. Joe and I know each other well. For people who aren't in transplant, I had a donor death in 2010. It was publicized actually all over the United States, so you might have seen it even if you weren't in Boston. But that's how I came to know Joe. And I think the American Society of Transplant Surgeons was the first society to start peer-to-peer support. And the reason why we did it is because I found that when there was the donor death, that there was support set up for literally everyone, anesthesia, nursing, floor nurses, cafeteria workers, friends of friends of friends who worked at the hospital, everyone except the surgeons. And that's when I really realized just how frightening it was to really be alone. And I came and talked to Joe about it. Bottom line is we started a peer-to-peer support right before COVID because we were supposed to invite Joe to this very hotel to do the teaching. And so my point is for this organization, okay, we train people, everybody loved the idea. Every year people say, are you going to train more people? You're going to train more people. The reality is not as many people access it as you hope. Now, when do they access it the most? Well, we had somebody at the American Society of Transplant Surgeons administrative office who was fabulous about sending out these little anonymous snippets that would be somebody's the quote, and it would be something like, I was 3 years out in practice and things were going great and I was at the top of my game, and then I had a series of complications and really started to doubt myself, and I wish I had a peer support person to talk to. And then we put the link at the bottom of it. On days like that, all of a sudden you'd have a spike of people because it was easy, because you just read it on your phone and you were just like, you know what, this is so true. And you click it. But if you have to go back to your office because you're just like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. Go log, some other crisis happened. Somebody just walked into your office with yet another problem. You don't do it. So I would really say, if you want to make this work, you kind of need a champion who can do that sort of thing and enlist people in the society to keep sending these little, tiny little paragraphs that are just enough to go out in some kind of a text memo thing that people can just click. It just resonates with you on a Tuesday when you just had it, you're ready to quit. And you just see that and you think, you know what? Somebody understands what I'm thinking about. So Joe, you and I talked about that. That's the problem with it not being an institution. You can't have automatic referral,
Right.
but nobody understands you better than the people in this society.
Yeah.
They understand you way better than the people in the hospital.
Yeah.
In fact, some of the people in the hospital, you definitely don't want to talk to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, it's the people in the society that understand you the best. So I think that's the hardest thing to overcome when you try to do this in a society.
It is. Thank
Great
you.
advice, Liz. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brian Clary from San Diego. There was a great refresher to the grand rounds you gave us about a year ago, Joe, so I really appreciate it. My question dovetails a little bit off of Liz's there, but actually my perspective is you gave this list of things that in general should probably prompt a peer review, whether it's a lawsuit or a patient death or a major error. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on actually creating an automated approach and an opt-out sort of culture within a department. Specifically, this is the list of things that always trigger, a reach out from, our peer support, and you can opt out of that, but this is what we do. So can you comment a little bit on creating sort of an opt-out type of a culture or automated sort of triggers for this?
Yeah, I love the idea. Thank you for that framing. I think opt-out is exactly the way it should be. Again, it needs to be on a platter for us. It just, if it's not easy click, it just, people won't do it. So the problem that I think we face in our hospitals, for example, are that the person running the peer support program has to be made aware that there was a patient aggression or just a very, just a tragic outcome or an error or, just whatever, okay, or a lawsuit. They have to be made aware in order for that outreach to happen. And so what we've just actually done a study where we looked at where programs felt like they were successful in doing that were the ones especially that had a really good relationship with risk management, where risk management was like automatic. We're going to tell the head of the peer support there was this event. So I think it's getting the people who know what's going on the front lines, and including the chiefs and the managers or what have you, is have people automatically make those referrals so that they are automatically given as a reach out. And then it, of course, so I get, that's the challenge. I do think as we, really start to integrate this, it'll be easier for people because it'll be sort of expected in a sense, but it isn't yet. I mean, think of all the decades of, vulnerability equals, weakness that we are trying to overcome. So, but I think logistically, you all are going to be aware of events. So you want to make sure that there's, that people know about this so that somebody can reach out to the colleague. So I think, but opt-out is absolutely the way it should be. It should be automatic. And that's what I've taught for every peer support program is, when they're hospital-based, is don't wait for people to show signs of suffering. Just simply say, oh, there was this event. Every time there's this event, we reach out. And this is at Intermountain. They use this. It's what we had at the Brigham. I think it's still in place. I'm not sure. I left there just 3 years ago, but which was anyone named in a lawsuit got a letter from me and the chief medical officer saying, hey, welcome to the club. But, basically, just sort of some of the common emotions. And then I or someone who'd been through it, who I trained, would do a reach out to that person. Every single time, everybody named in a lawsuit got a reach out for defendant support. And I think that was like, you have to wire it in there. Wire it into the patient safety where, there's a spreadsheet on every harm event was peer support offered. So that all those groups that are hearing of things happen, whether it's risk or whether it's patient safety or faculty, development, whatever, those people just automatically, was it offered? Let's just make sure it was. Thank you.
Yep, Dr.
Hi,
Ballmer.
Chuck Ballmer from Penn in Philadelphia. Our job has a lot of parallels to the military. You have to be steely. It's a tactical job. Adversaries against us, lives are on the line, etc. How do they handle this kind of stuff? Have you explored it? Have you looked into it, see a contrast to what you're doing?
Yeah, it's a great observation. So first of all, the people that we modeled the original peer support program when we were at the Brigham, we modeled after were the first responders, not the military, but they have a very, the EMTs and they have a very robust peer support program. Theirs is a little more heavy-handed in the sense they pull people offline, say, you're not going to work, you're going to come and talk to me. And so we want to modify it in that way. But that said, so we that's been around for years. In fact, the whole crisis intervention stress management is peer support is an offshoot of that. Again, there's some issues around that have been published around forcing people to talk. So I don't actually believe that we should do that. The military, so they have the same problem. They have the same culture of independence. And I don't want to be weak. Maybe worse than ours, but it's very parallel. So they've used some different systems. One is they have a buddy system in some places where you sort of have somebody assigned to you to sort of check on you, within your unit. But they don't have, and the people, and I do know some people work on PTSD prevention. There is more of an outreach, post-deployment. But I have to tell you, I've worked with military organizations, the one in San Antonio, I've worked the VA in San Diego. So this is military medical. They didn't. One of the most successful, I think, peer support programs is at in San Antonio. They've really nailed it, I think, but they have such a tough culture. So I think, they don't have, it's a bit different in terms of what their model is, but so we took a little from this and a little from that. Thank you.
Hossein Amiri from Louisiana. This experience I'm going to talk about is from 20 years ago, which I was in Tennessee, Memphis. And I don't know if it will change anything or not. I have got to consult to see a patient, a 21-year-old nursing student, and whose mother was a nurse and did not have any insurance, got fulminant liver failure and was dying. So I did everything that I could possibly to get the patient listed, got a special permission to transplant this patient, and we got offered rapidly, and I transplanted the patient in the middle of the night. Transplant went very successfully. 10-15 minutes after reperfusion, anesthesiologist told me that patient is dying, and the patient died. I had no reason for the patient's death. You can imagine that how devastated I was. It was around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and I could not believe what to do. So I went to my office, was next to my OR, and tried to think and fell into sleep on my chair. Around 7 or 8 o'clock, somebody banged the door and came and told me that we found the reason for death. What was that? That the orderly who brought the blood for the patient that anesthesiologist asked. The ICU was next to our OR, brought 2 blood, one for the patient in ICU and one for your patient. An anesthesiologist did not check the blood, gave the blood wrongly to your patient died because of that. Luckily, they did not give the blood to the other patient. So now I understand it. And against all the advice that I should not talk to the family and the patient is dead is a big issue. I right away went to the mother, which I had talked before. I told her that I don't know why your daughter died. Everything was fine. And we were giving report time after time. Suddenly said, your daughter is dead. So I went and explained exactly what happened. And I said that now you know that. That's the cause, and you can sue us all. And because you have all the evidence. You know what she said? That was the fate of my daughter, Dr. Amiri. Forgive everything. I'm not going to sue you. That's the way that, I don't know if it changed anything in this country, but that my instinct and my personality told me that I have to be honest right away with the patient rather than formulating different things. I went and honestly told him, and that finished.
Yes, and that's a beautiful story, case of a compassionate and transparent disclosure. What we've seen is people generally have trouble doing that, right? And in some ways, it's even harder if it's not your fault, if you will, because you're sort of disclosing other people's errors in a sense. And so some of us have written on this. I do believe that we need to support the healthcare team and especially the physician in charge in having those conversations. What can you say? Because people do say all sorts of weird stuff. Let me tell you. I mean, and it's because they're terrified. I get it, but it's not great, and it can be throwing other people under the bus. It can be overly taking on responsibility that wasn't theirs. It can be failing to be empathic, dismissing concerns, lots of things. And I attribute it all to abject fear. And so we paired peer support and disclosure coaching. And I think that at these moments, it's really important to do that. Do not send somebody in to have the most difficult conversation of their careers without any help beforehand. I mean, you did the right thing on your own, but not everybody will. And I believe, we should be there for each other at these really difficult times. Now, with disclosure conversation coaching, the focus is on the patient and family needs. And what we say is, we'll support your needs, but your job right now, we'll support you to do this, is to meet as much as you can the patient and family needs. So it's not the exact same thing, but they're obviously, overlapping. But thank you for sharing that. Good for you that you did that.
Dr. Collins.
Kelly Collins from the University of Wisconsin. Thank you so much for your comments. And I think the thought about making a culture change is really important. And I think M&M is a great opportunity for that. We always present the case and then start to dissect it. And we never really say to the people, the first comment should probably be, I'm so sorry that happened to you and your team. And I'm sure you did the best you could in those circumstances. And then now, how can we talk about the medical and the surgical to try to understand how we could do that better?
Yes, thank you. And I'm working with a group of surgeons nationally, some from Mass General, but on how can we change M&M so that, look, M&M's not going to be an emotional debrief. Like that's going to be probably have to be done, separately. That's just not going to happen. But they can be structured in a way that where the mantra is, we are all here to learn, and we're here for each other in service of learning. So let's remember that. And then because I think one of the two things can happen in M&M on extreme. One is that shame and blame. And the other is we see this, because we're so afraid of actually digging in, but it should be much more, it's got to be rigorous and compassionate. Right? That's not either or. We need to look at this and say, anybody presenting a case should say, or the attending in charge of that should say, should be asked the question or ask it out loud, knowing what I know now, what would I repeat going forward? Because you should do more of the good thing. And what would I do differently going forward? It should be a process where that is how it's framed, as opposed to, I really screwed up, or, hey, we see this, and everybody's reassuring each other. So yeah, I think M&M is ideal. And I think, just as you said, I love how you said it, just the acknowledgement. Before we move forward, just want to acknowledge this is really hard. And we've all been there, and we're sorry you have to go through this. What a beautiful thing to say just at the outset. It's not going to stop us from learning and digging in and being rigorous, but let's just acknowledge our humanity here. This is hard. This is hard. Thank you.
That was great, Joe. Thank you. That was fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you.